Welcome to this session. My name is Barbara Gochalia. We are continuing from where we stopped last time, and we are looking at the environment. We are looking at externalities and the environment. And we saw that an externality is a market failure. And we looked at what externalities are. We looked at the negative externality in production. We looked at, for example, pollution. We looked at negative externality in consumption. And we saw the measures that the government uses to internalize these externalities or to respond to these externalities. We saw that the government uses, for example, corrective taxes or the Piguvian tax. The government uses tradable permits. The government can use regulations or laws. The government can ban the production of certain goods that are harmful to human health. The government can also do what we call persuasive advertisement, right? To discourage people from consuming goods or products that are harmful to their health, for example, cigarettes. So we saw that we looked at tradable permits, and we are looking at the advantages of tradable permits, one of which is that they are an incentive to reduce pollution. We looked at how these tradable permits actually work, right? And then we saw that they are called tradable because they can be sold among these farms. And then these tradable permits also help to create a clear price for pollution. We remember we saw that a negative externality is either a benefit or cost of market transaction that is not reflected in the price of a commodity, but it happens to a third party who is not involved in the market transaction. And therefore, because of that, the government comes in to correct this market failure of pollution by imposing a tax or tradable permits, for example. And these taxes and tradable permits, they actually help in attaching a price to the pollution. Then these tradable permits, they create a clear limit on the quantity of pollution that will be created each year. Of course, if the government is monopoly over the supply of these permits, it can reduce the supply of these permits by increasing the price of these permits or licenses, thereby making it costly for these polluting farms, making it costly in terms of their cost of production, and therefore this will reduce their output and therefore the amount of pollution emitted in the environment. The pollution, we look at the greenhouse gas emissions like carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, methane, and so on. Then these tradable permits, as well as the tradable permits, they help in reducing the number of permits available, right? So it is a control measure whereby the government uses these permits to control the price and be able to reduce the supply of these tradable permits, increase the price, reduce the output produced as a result of increased cost of production for these polluting farms, right? Then the disadvantages. When these tradable permits are used or they are used by the government, it has some advantages. Some disadvantages. One of them is that the price of these permits is determined by the free market and may be too low to create strong incentives to reduce the pollution. What we mean by this is that much as the government is controlling the supply of these permits, but it will also depend on the demand. The government will control the supply of the permits, yes, but then also the demand for these permits by these polluting farms will also determine whether these permits are going to be bought or not. Yeah. So the government can control the supply of the permits by increasing the prices of these permits or licenses, but it also depends on the demand, the forces of demand for these permits. So if the demand for these permits is low, I mean, if the demand for these permits is low, then it means that it will not be applicable. It will not be effective for the government, right? So the government can increase the price of these permits, but at the end of the day, you find that maybe even these farms are not demanding for these permits. So the demand for these permits will determine the price. Remember, the price is determined by both the forces of demand and supply, not by the supply alone. So the government will be working on the supply side, but the demand side will be from on the side of the polluting farms. Then also it can be that another disadvantage, it can be that the amount of permits decided by the government may be too high if polluting industries are allowed to influence the policy, right? So in this case, you may find that the permits, that it may be costly for these permits, right? The government might increase the prices of these permits, but at the end of the day, the government will find it hard to actually implement the policies on ground. Are we together? To actually, it involves monitoring these farms, number one. It involves monitoring these farms, whether they are really abiding. Because you may find that we've seen scenarios where these farms, they buy these permits to do a particular kind of business. But when they reach on ground, they do a different business from what the government issued the permit for. So this might be, in the end, it might be costly actually for the government issuing these permits. It might be in the long run, it might be a costly venture for the government, especially in terms of influencing this policy. Then also, it is costly to monitor industries to make sure everyone who pollutes has the permit to do so. So it is a task that involves government involvement, government monitoring these farms, actually going to the ground and ensuring that these farms are abiding by the commands that are set by the government, right? So this, what you call tradable permits, where these permits are sold among these polluting farms, is actually what we call the carbon market. Is actually what we call the carbon market. Of course, we realize that as the demand for these permits increases, as the demand for these tradable permits increases, the price will also increase, right? When the demand for these tradable permits or licenses increases, then we see that the price of these permits will also increase. And when the price of these permits increases, it becomes costly for these farms in terms of the cost of production, and therefore they will reduce the amount of output produced. And of course, reduced amount of output produced by these polluting farms definitely reduces the amount of pollution. So that is the logic behind the tradable permits and how the government uses them to control pollution, which is actually a negative externality of production. So what are the advantages? What are the advantages when the government imposes, for example, these tradable permits, when the government uses the tradable permits to control the pollution? So number one is that it reduces the society's cost because pollution rights can be bought and sold, right? The pollution rights can be bought and sold. And some of the farms will actually find it cheaper to buy the rights than to acquire the abatement equipment, the pollution abatement equipment. So these tradable permits, they are called tradable because these polluting farms sell these permits among themselves. So selling the permits is actually selling rights to pollute, right? Rights to pollute. And of course, at the end of the day, this might be cheaper than actually these farms buying what you call the pollution abatement equipment. Pollution abatement equipment simply means those kind of equipment that these manufacturing farms or polluting farms use, such that those greenhouse gas emissions like carbon dioxide, by the time they are filtered by this equipment, for example, the carbon dioxide will be filtered by this equipment such that by the time it's emitted into the atmosphere, it is not harmful to the environment, right? And then also with these tradable permits, we realize that they are conservation groups. For example, environmentalists, yeah? Environmentalists can also buy these tradable permits, therefore buying the right to pollute. So these environmentalists can buy these tradable permits from government with the instance of the objective of attaining the right to pollute. And of course, here, when they buy these permits, tradable permits from the government, of course, they are denying these polluting farms from acquiring these permits. And at the end of the day, it will reduce the number of permits available. It will become costly for these polluting farms in terms of acquiring these permits, and some of them will end up exiting the industry. So that's how it works. Then revenue from the sale of pollution rights could be used to improve the environment. Of course, when the government sells these tradable permits to the polluting farms, it generates government revenue, right? Which can also be used to protect, which can also be used to improve the environment. Then the rising cost of pollution rights should lead to improved pollution control techniques. Of course, as the government reduces the supply of these tradable permits, like we've already seen, it becomes costly for these polluting farms in terms of the cost of production. And of course, they will be forced, these polluting farms will be forced to acquire the pollution abatement equipment, and thereby this pollution abatement equipment will help these farms to actually reduce the population, whereby these greenhouse gas emissions like carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, will be controlled or filtered by this equipment, the pollution abatement equipment, such that by the time they are emitted to the environment, they are not harmful to the environment. Now, that was taxation. We looked at the corrective taxes that the government uses to respond to negative externality in production, which is pollution, for example, by the polluting farms. We've looked at tradable permits. The government uses the tradable permits, stroke licenses, to control pollution. We are looking at, which is a negative externality in production, and now we are looking at them in details. We are looking at the government now using regulations or laws, right? So the government can use the regulations or laws, which we also call the command and control approach, right? So in these regulations, the government monitors these emissions of these polluting farms. It monitors them and finds out, right? And of course, at the end of the day, this might be costly and difficult, right, for the polluters, because if the government monitors them, of course, it requires them to abide by the environmental regulations that reduce pollution. The government can also, through this approach of regulations and laws of command and control, it can enforce penalties. Penalties meaning that for these farms that fail to abide by the regulations, by the environmental regulations set by the government, they will be punished. They will be penalized, right? And then the government can also use incentives. The government can also use incentives for these of course, incentives means that the government can, for example, provide, the government can, for example, reduce the taxes on the pollution abatement equipment, yeah, such that they are cheaper now for these farms to use. So the government can use the incentives, right? So with regulations at the end of the day, for the polluting farms, we realize that this is the same curve that we looked at of pollution, where we saw that the marginal social cost is greater than the marginal private cost. And we saw that with this kind of curve actually explaining the negative externality in production, which is, for example, polluting industry. Here, when the government uses regulation, whereby it may be, for example, reduces the taxes, the price of the pollution abatement equipment, of course, this will be an incentive, and thereby it will reduce the amount of pollution. It will reduce the amount of pollution. All right. So when the government reduces the taxes on the pollution abatement equipment, of course, the cost of production, yeah, the cost of reducing pollution will lower for these polluting farms. And of course, at the end of the day, the cost of production will reduce, right? The cost of production will reduce for them, and thereby it will reduce on the pollution, because these pollution abatement equipment will help these farms to reduce the pollution. So it will be reducing that negative externality of production. It will be reducing that negative externality of production. All right, let's continue. So we can look at here negative externality of production and the consumption. For example, here we can look at examples here. Drink driving or drunk driving is a negative externality in what? It's a negative externality in consumption, because when you drink, you are consuming, right? Then air pollution is a negative externality in what? Is a negative externality of production, because pollution comes as a result of these farms manufacturing during the production process, right? Right? And then overfishing, that is a negative externality in consumption, because the fish is consumed, right? Then airport noise. Airport noise, by the way, is also a negative externality, but it's a negative externality in consumption, because the noise will go into your ears, which is an element of consumption, yeah? So it's a negative externality in consumption. Cigarette smoke. Cigarette smoke That one, we've already seen it. We already looked at it, that it was a negative externality in consumption, because the person taking a cigarette is literally consuming the cigarette smoke, right? So you should be able to think. Fast foods, that is a negative externality in consumption, because these fast foods, as the person continues taking them, may end up getting diseases. You know, those fast foods, they have a lot of oil. So you just have to look at the activity and you think, what kind of externality is it? Is it a negative externality in consumption or production? So let us look at a positive externality of production. We've been looking at negative externalities. Let us look at a positive externality of production. Positive externality of production. Now, the logic here is simple. The logic of drawing these curves. Now, if you have drawn the curve for a negative externality of production, it is going to be the same curve here for positive externality of production. But what is going to change is the labeling. What is going to change is the labeling. Remember, we saw that we have already seen that with the negative externality in production, or the negative externality of production, yes, the marginal social cost, yeah, is greater than the marginal private benefit, is above the marginal private what? Sorry, the marginal private cost. The marginal social cost is greater than the marginal private cost. Then this one will be the marginal social benefit curve. The marginal, remember we saw that the demand curve stands for marginal, the demand curve stands for benefit, marginal benefit. So this one will be the marginal social benefit. And then from there, you determine the point of equilibrium where the marginal social benefit meets the marginal social cost. That will be the point of optimal efficiency, or the point of allocative efficiency. Right? And then there will be another equilibrium there where we see the marginal private cost meeting the marginal social benefit. That will actually be the point of the actual price in the market and the actual output produced in the market. This will be the optimal output, right? This will be the optimal price, right? That was the logic. So this one is a negative now. This one I've drawn here is a negative externality in production. A negative externality of production, which you have just looked at. Now, when it comes to a positive externality of production, the diagram is the same. But the only thing that changes, you interchange the labeling. What has been up comes down. So here, this one is going to be now the marginal private cost. You are just interchanging the what? The labeling. Here, it will instead be the marginal private cost that will be greater than the marginal social cost. Than the marginal social cost. You interchange, right? And then from there, you look, and of course, if this is the marginal social cost, this other demand curve that cuts across is going to be the marginal social benefit. Remember, the demand curve represents the marginal benefit, marginal social benefit. Then you look for a point where the marginal social cost meets the marginal social benefit. That will be the point of optimal efficiency, where the marginal social cost meets the marginal social benefit, will be the point of optimal efficiency that we are calling QS naught, and it will generate a corresponding price, PS naught. So PS naught will be the optimal price, yeah, and the QS naught will be the optimal amount of pollution, right? And so at that point there, it's the point of optimal efficiency. Optimal efficiency, or a point of allocative efficiency, where we operate at an equilibrium, right? In other words, at that point, there is no excess pollution. There is no, like, it is the optimal, the actual amount of pollution that is required to be polluted. Then we shall have another equilibrium, of course, here, which is not the optimal, where we see that it is an equilibrium where the marginal social benefit will be meeting the marginal private benefit, and this other equilibrium, which is not the optimal, will actually give us what is happening on actual ground, the actual price in the market, and the actual amount of pollution produced, the actual amount of pollution that is produced. Now, with positive externalities, we have to still not take key notes. Basically, 3 things to note here, 3 concepts or 3 note kind of elements to note here with a positive, just like we noted with a negative externality. So with the positive externality, what we have to note is that the marginal private cost is greater than the marginal social cost. The marginal private cost is greater than the marginal social cost with positive externality of production. The marginal private cost is greater than the marginal social cost than the marginal social cost. Number 2, with the positive externality in production, you should be noting down these. If you note down these things, even if I woke you up from your at night and I tell you, draw for me this curve, you will never struggle. You will never struggle as long as you have these 3 elements at the back of your mind, right? So another important element for us to note here is that for all externalities, the point of optimal efficiency is attained at the point where the marginal social benefit is equal to the marginal social cost. The point of optimal efficiency, or the point of allocative efficiency, or the point of equilibrium is attained at the point where the marginal social benefit is equal to the marginal social cost. Number 3, for positive externality. Positive externality, positive externality, what we have to note here, positive externality of production, what we have to note is that the positive externalities, generally for positive externalities, they are always undersupplied in the market. Positive externalities are always undersupplied or underallocated. Positive externalities are undersupplied in the market, or they are underallocated in the market, whereas negative externalities are oversupplied in the market or overallocated in the market. With the positive externalities, they are undersupplied in the market. Just like you see that good people are few in the world. Good people are few in the world. So even with positive externalities, generally, whether in production or consumption, they are undersupplied in the market. So with those 3 elements here, we shall be able to draw our graph for positive externality of production. So the 3rd element, we've already looked at the point of equilibrium, which is point 1 to note. We've already looked at that with positive externality, the marginal private cost is greater than the marginal social cost. And the 3rd thing is for us to know that with positive externalities, they are always undersupplied in the market, because we realize here that actually the actual amount of we realize here the actual amount of output produced. Now, let us look at an example of positive externality in production. Positive externality in production, for example, here we have what we call ecotourism. Ecotourism services. Ecotourism services, for example, where we have, for example, forests. You can have a forest where the tourists come and they visit that forest. Yeah, the forests are for tourism attraction. So when these tourists come to visit the forest, of course they generate their revenue, government revenue, right? But at the end of the day, we realize that the benefits that the society attain from these tourism attractions, like forests, like rivers, right, is more. You find that, for example, for a river, for a lake, people are getting water from that river. That water, they are drinking it, they're using it for washing, right? It's a lot. They can fish, right? So the benefit they are getting is more than the government revenue actually from the tourism attraction. That's what it means for a positive externality of production, right? And so that when we say that marginal private cost is greater than the marginal social cost, actually, we literally mean that the benefit that the society is getting, yeah, if the cost of society is lower than the cost of actually maintaining that tourism attraction by the government, then it literally means that the society is benefiting more from using those tourism attraction, I should say, resources like forests, like lakes. Are we together? Yeah, because, for example, for the lakes, they are used to regulate. They help in regulation of the they help in the hydro cycle, formation of the rainfall. So all those benefits are greater than the actual cost, for example, that the government uses to maintain these tourism attractions. So I hope we get that, right? I hope we get that. Libra is raising up a hand. Yes, Libra. Yes, Libra. Yes, Libra. You're raising up a hand. All right. All right. So I hope we have got that. If there is anything unclear, please let me know such that we get on the same page. So that was a positive externality of production, where we've seen an example of the eco-tourism industry, where we see these tourist attractions, for example, that generate more benefit to the society than what actually the government can incur in terms of costs of maintaining these tourism attractions like forests and rivers and lakes. Then we have, that was a positive externality in production. So let us look at a positive externality of consumption, a positive externality. Libra is saying that she had a question that why are positive externalities under allocated in the market? Why are positive externalities under allocated in the market. Now, let us look at the positive externality in consumption. I think after looking at a positive externality in consumption, it is going to help us really understand why the positive externalities are undersupplied in the market. So let us look at positive externality in consumption. So an example of a positive externality in consumption is education. Education is a positive externality in consumption. Now, the logic behind drawing these curves of externalities is simple. The logic behind drawing these curves of externalities is simple. So we saw that if it is an externality in consumption, you're going to have two demand curves. If it's an externality in consumption, you're going to have two demand curves and one supply curve, right? And then we looked at our diagram for externality in what? For a negative externality in consumption. If you can look at those curves again, I don't know if you have the time to look at them, but let me draw and we see the logic behind. So if it's an externality in consumption, an externality in consumption, just an externality in consumption, you're going to have two demand curves and one supply curve. Why two demand curves? Because the demand curves are representing benefit. They are representing benefit. The supply curve is representing cost, right? So when someone is consuming a product, they are benefiting. There is a benefit they are gaining from that consumption. So that's why we are drawing two demand curves which represent benefit and one supply curve. Now we saw that with a negative externality, we already looked at a negative externality in what? In consumption. A negative externality in consumption. And we saw, for example, a cigarette industry. Yeah, cigarette industry where, for example, we looked at BAT. And we saw that with the negative externality in consumption, the marginal private benefit is greater than the marginal social benefit. The marginal private benefit is greater than the marginal social benefit, and then the corresponding demand curve. If this is marginal social benefit, this one will be marginal social cost. Marginal social cost. And then we saw that from there, after drawing that, after identifying that, the next thing you have to know is that what is the point of optimal efficiency or the point of equilibrium? The point of optimal efficiency will be at the point where the marginal social cost equals to the marginal social benefit. So what is that point? Marginal social cost is equal to marginal social benefit. It will be this point of intersection here, where the marginal social cost is equal to the marginal social benefit. Marginal social benefit. That is the point of optimal efficiency, optimal allocation of resources, or the point of allocative efficiency, which gives us an equilibrium here, which we can call equilibrium note, which it generates an optimal price, which we can call PE, and it also generates a corresponding optimal we can call it P prime, I mean P naught. We can call this one P naught as the optimal price, P naught, corresponding with the optimal quantity of pollution, which is Q naught. And then the other equilibrium there, where marginal social cost is meeting the marginal private benefit, will be an equilibrium that actually gives us the actual amount of pollution, which we can call QE, corresponding to the actual price, that is actually charged. If this is cigarette, maybe a cigarette factory, the actual price charged for the cigarettes, which we can call PE, right? So this one generates a second equilibrium that actually shows the actual what is happening on the ground, actual price, actual amount of pollution, right, in the market. So from here we realize that if the actual that is produced is greater than the optimal for a negative externality in consumption, we realize that Q naught, QE, what is the actual amount of pollution produced, is greater than the ideal or the optimal amount of pollution that is required. So there it means that negative externalities are oversupplied in the market. Negative externalities are oversupplied in the market. So that's how we looked at the negative externality in production, where we looked at, for example, the cigarette industry, like BAT, British American Tobacco. And what the government does here, we saw that the government with negative externality, as long as it's negative externality, it imposes a tax. Here, which we actually saw as the Pigouvian tax or the corrective tax, which tax will actually make it costly for these farms. It will increase the cost of production for these farms. It will reduce the output produced for these farms. The farms will reduce the output produced, and therefore reduced output will now reduce the actual amount of pollution slowly up to the point of optimal efficiency, up to the point of the optimal amount of pollution that should be emitted to the atmosphere. Now, when it comes to positive externality, of consumption, when it comes to positive externality of consumption, and here we are seeing that with the positive externality of consumption, we have an example of education. Education is a positive externality of consumption. Education. Now, the diagram for positive externality in consumption is going to be the same as the diagram for negative what? Externality in consumption. The only difference is going to be the labeling. We are just going now to interchange the labeling. Now here we interchange. Now here with positive externality, the marginal social benefit now is going to be greater than the marginal private benefit. We are just interchanging. What has been up, we put it down. So here the marginal social benefit is going to be above the marginal, is going to be greater than the marginal private benefit, the marginal private benefit. All right? We are just interchanging the labeling, by the way. So if this one is the marginal social benefit, this demand curve here, the supply curve here, which represents cost, is going to be the marginal social cost curve. Then we look for the point of equilibrium, where the marginal social benefit meets the marginal social cost. So that would be the point of equilibrium, which is actually the point of optimal efficiency, the point of the optimal efficiency, which optimal efficiency means that point where the ideal or the actual how can I call it, the required amount of pollution, there is that amount of pollution that should be required where we don't have excess pollution, we do not have excess, we do not have shortage. That is the optimal. Optimal means we are in an equilibrium, we don't have excess, we don't have shortage in terms of pollution. So it will generate an optimal price. This is equilibrium note, optimal price P note, and the optimal amount of pollution, which is Q, which you can call QS note, right? And then this other equilibrium here, which is not optimal, it will actually give us the actual, what is happening on ground, the actual price, for example, for education here, which we can call PE, and then the actual amount, right? The actual amount of education supplied, which we can call QE, And at the end of the day, we realize that the actual amount of education that is provided is below the optimal, the required. Yeah. So here we realize that with negative externality in consumption, for example, education, we realize that the actual amount of education, which we can call QSE, right, is less. It is less because it is below QS note, the optimal. So it is less than the optimal amount of education that should be provided, right? So there it becomes that the positive externalities are always under supplied in the market. But I'm getting to why they are under supplied in the market. Now, before we look at why these positive externalities are, someone was asking, Libra was asking, I think, why negative externalities are oversupplied and why positive externalities are undersupplied. We are getting there. So I'm going to explain why. I'm going to explain how the government now responds to a positive externality of consumption, like education. Now, when we say when we talk about the marginal social benefit, in this perspective of education, right? The marginal, when people educated, when people get education, when citizens of a country are educated, what are the advantages of people being educated? So let's look at the advantages of citizens being educated is what we call the marginal social benefit. Society is benefiting. What does society benefit from the citizens being educated is the marginal social benefit. So these will be the marginal social benefits of education will be that an educated citizen will be more productive in his life or her life, contributing more to the national output, right? To the national output. This person can pay taxes. If this person is employed or is an entrepreneur, they can pay taxes. They pay taxes to the government. So that is a benefit. That is the marginal social benefit of the citizens being educated. Yes. Another marginal social benefit is that when they are educated and they become business owners or entrepreneurs, they offer employment to other citizens. So they help eliminate unemployment by, if they're entrepreneurs, they offer employment. So that is a marginal social benefit of education. I hope we are getting that. And the positive externalities are called merit goods. Positive externalities are called a merit good, while negative externalities are called demerit good. Demerit good for negative externalities, merit good for positive externalities, right? So positive externalities can also be called spillover benefits to society, and negative externalities are called spillover costs to society. So with education, we have seen that when people get educated, they contribute taxes. We can even realize that when people are educated, it reduces, keeping other factors constant, it reduces on the crime rate. Because in most cases, it's the uneducated people that are pickpocketing around the streets and so on. But if people are educated and we are assuming they are getting jobs, they are getting employed, they are becoming entrepreneurs, then the crimes will reduce. So all those are positive benefits, which we basically call the marginal social benefit. So with education, which is a positive externality of consumption, that's why we say that the marginal social benefit is greater than the marginal private benefit. What is the marginal private benefit? The marginal private benefit, for example, when someone is an individual incurs in education, right? Let's assume that this individual is a doctor, right? Is studying to become a what? Is a medical student studying to become a doctor, right? So this medical student will pay money, will pay tuition to the medical school or to the institution that is teaching him. He will pay his tuition. That is a marginal private, that is, he's paying his tuition, right? But after paying his tuition, after he has become a doctor, graduated to become a doctor, this doctor can work for the government. When he works for the government, he will be given a salary. The government will give him a salary. That salary will be called the marginal private benefit for that doctor, because it is the benefit that he got after investing in education. It will be, his salary will be the marginal private benefit. Are we getting? But then we realize that if this doctor is working in a government hospital, and maybe it reaches time of remember that most of the government hospitals, they offer most of these services, the medical services are subsidized. For example, vaccination is either subsidized or free, or given out free by the government. So if this doctor, for example, is issuing out a vaccine to the people, to the country's citizens, this vaccine will be free of charge. So at the end of the day, these citizens are benefiting from this doctor's education. Remember, for him, he incurred his money to study to become a doctor. But now for them, at this time, he's issuing a vaccine to the citizens. Don't you think they are getting something free? They're getting a vaccine free. They're getting a free service from this doctor. So it means that the citizens are benefiting more than the doctor is benefiting from his salary as a result of the education that he incurred to become a doctor. So that's why we say the marginal social benefit is greater than the marginal private benefit in with positive externality in consumption. And then to explain why these why positive externalities are undersupplied in the market, look at doctors. How many doctors are there in the world? Can you tell me? Maybe you can answer that question. Yes? You saw what happened with the COVID challenge, COVID-19. We were actually praying, economies were, or countries were actually praying to have more doctors at that time, which was impossible. Are you getting? So at that time when the world was grappling with COVID-19, we admired to have more doctors. because they were at the forefront of doing what? Of fighting the disease. They were the ones treating these people. Yes, government was incurring money, but even if you incur money when the doctors are not there to treat, you end up all of you dying. So I can ask you a question. Why are doctors few in the world? Because we've seen that example of education where maybe these doctors are educating, maybe a doctor is a positive externality in consumption. So it's just by default. I cannot explain that, but you also know that doctors are few in the world. I always say that positive externalities, somehow, somewhere, that even good people are few in the world, right? So I cannot explain the reason why, for example, the doctors are few in the world, right? Because we saw what was happening. Hospitals were flooded. Doctors were few, not here only in our country, but around the world. And the demand for doctors was actually higher at that time. Yeah, we saw the need. For example, the government saw that it is useful to invest, for example, in educating doctors. Are we together? Not only doctors, but education practically, because we've seen that with education, it has more advantages than what those individuals incur to educate themselves, than that what the personal individuals incur to pay their tuition. So you pay your tuition, you become a productive citizen. At the end of the day, you'll be paying taxes, contributing taxes to the government. These taxes are used for different services. Yeah, the taxes can be used to construct roads. The taxes can be used to provide medicine in the hospitals. So that is benefiting more of the society than you yourself, an individual who educated yourself. So that's why we say the marginal social benefit is greater than the marginal private benefit for positive externality in consumption. And that's one reason why positive externalities are undersupplied in the market, right? So I don't know whether I've answered the question. And then to go for why negative externalities are always oversupplied in the market. We've seen that, for example, negative externalities, we saw an example of pollution. We saw an example of pollution. This pollution, we just control it, right? We just control it. You cannot say that we are having an optimal amount of pollution, but rather the government just takes those measures to reduce the pollution. Are we together? Because it would be a little hard for you to say that we have now reduced the pollution to the optimal amount. Why? Because the government, of course, because in most cases, we see industrialization increasing. We are seeing the world industrializing, more industries are being built, cars are increasing, which pollute, right? Exhaust fumes. So as the world, for example, gets more developed, industrialization increasing, of course, pollution does what? Increases. So at the end of the day, it will be upon governments for different countries to control that pollution. So I don't know if I've answered your question, Libra. Have I answered? All right. And then I'm still going to use the same curve to explain what the government does to internalize positive externalities, for example, or to respond to this positive externality. So we've seen that a positive externality is a good thing. It's a merit good. And a positive externality, we've seen that by definition, it is a benefit of market transaction that is not reflected in the price of a good, but it happens to a third party. So we see that, for example, here, this is a benefit to society where citizens are benefiting from free immunization that is being issued by this doctor who paid his tuition to become a doctor. So the benefit here will be more. Just imagine the whole of a country's citizens like Uganda, they are being, for example, vaccinated against COVID-19. Don't you think that is more, the benefit that is got is more, the marginal social benefit is more than the marginal private benefit of a doctor in terms of his salary that he gets? So because of that, the government responds to positive externalities by subsidizing. Subsidizing is an opposite of taxation. So the government will subsidize positive externality in consumption. And the one way, for example, if it is education, the government will provide, subsidizing means the government can provide scholarships. The government can do what? For example, if governments around the world invested more in providing scholarships, maybe to doctors, nurses, and many medical workers before the COVID-19 pandemic came in, don't you think it would be a great tool in fighting against the COVID-19 pandemic if they had done it earlier, to provide scholarships and get more doctors, educate more doctors? Don't you think that one would help in fighting against the COVID-19 pandemic? All right, I'm not getting any response, but I know that at the back of our minds, we have the answers. So the government can, for example, provide scholarships. The government can provide the scholastic materials to schools, right? The government can construct schools, right? Help these some of these private schools maybe to provide scholastic material, that kind of thing, such that education, because it knows that when these citizens are educated, at the end of the day, they will be able to, for example, contribute to the government revenue in the form of taxes. So the government subsidizes, the government can subsidize consumers, for example, schools, students, those are consumers. It can also subsidize producers. It can also subsidize producers if it is a positive externality of production. Sorry, if it is a positive externality of a positive externality of production, right? So I hope there is no question, any question there at that point? So I think I've explained the diagrams where we saw positive externality of consumption is, for example, market for education. We've seen that. And then let us see other responses to how the government responds to positive externalities. So we have seen that with positive externality, the government uses the corrective subsidies to producers, right? Corrective subsidies to producers by, for example, with the subsidy to producers, it can, for example, it can reduce the taxes on a number of commodities for producers. Then corrective subsidies to consumers, like how we've seen scholarships for education, right? And then the government provision for positive externality in consumption. Government can provide these services, these goods, right? For example, the government can construct hospitals, yeah? The government can construct schools to subsidize education. The government can construct hospitals and healthcare centers such that, for example, we needed more, the world needed more healthcare centers, yeah? Especially in that dilemma of COVID-19, not just buildings, but that are equipped, healthcare centers or hospitals that are equipped with relevant equipment like oxygen machines, yeah? The government can also construct, for example, bridges, airports, because of course it knows that with these bridges, roads, and airports, that one increases, stimulates trade, yeah? The government also can provide the police security, right? The government can do what? Can provide police security. Then the government can also do a positive advertising, right? For example, it can encourage people, for example, to get vaccines, yeah? Positive advertising. By the way, another example of positive externality in consumption, we have seen education, but also another example of positive externalities in consumption is vaccination. Vaccination, right? Because with vaccination, when the government, for example, subsidizes these vaccines, most of them are actually given out free of charge by the government. Let me say vaccines against maybe COVID-19, yeah? Or even these other immunizable diseases that children get, and they are vaccinated. So the government, of course, knows when it subsidizes these vaccines or even gives them out for free, like for these diseases, like for example, COVID-19, it knows that this will reduce the spread of the virus. It will reduce the spread of the virus because what we know is that an unproductive population can never contribute to government revenue, right? An unproductive, if just imagine people are having COVID-19 all over the place, yeah? What happened? People were not working. You know what happened with that, the lockdowns, yeah? So of course the government knows if it's investing in providing these, subsidizing these vaccines and providing, then it's going to reduce on the spread of the virus, and then of course people will be productive and work and contribute to government revenue. So there it means that the marginal social benefit will be greater than the marginal private benefit, right? So the government can also encourage people, for example, to go for vaccines, to get vaccinated. Okay, Libra says, yes, I have understood. No, madam, you are clear. All right. All right. So that's how the government can either respond to positive externalities, and whether in production or consumption, it can provide corrective subsidies to producers or to consumers. It can also provide these goods. Remember, we've seen that market failure comes in because the free market, which is basically a perfectly competitive market, has failed to provide these goods, has failed to provide these goods and services efficiently in the market. So at the end of the day, of course, when it fails to provide, we shall not be operating at an equilibrium. Either we have undersupply of these goods and services or oversupply. Whereby undersupply, for example, we've seen undersupply of education, right? Undersupply of security service, security or defense, right? In the country. Just imagine there are few policemen in the country. What will happen? The crime rates will increase. Just imagine there are few doctors in the country, especially during COVID-19 pandemic. What will happen? People will all people the whole country will will get COVID-19, and you'll be there in your houses locked up. You'll have sequences of lockdowns. Yeah. So that's what the government, for example, provides these vaccinations free of charge, encourages people to get vaccinated, for example, that kind of thing, right? So that's how the government internalizes these positive externalities, right? So we've looked at those diagrams already. Let us look at the Coas theorem. The Coas theorem. Now, Ronald Coas, in 1960, he propounded a theorem that was called after his name, the Coas theorem. And according to his theory, his theory was basically about negative externalities. He said that negative externalities could be solved if there was a private bargaining between the two parties. He said that negative externalities, for example, pollution, that could be dealt with. They could be dealt with or solved as long as there was private bargaining between the two parties. And he said that if there was private bargaining, that this private bargaining was, the assumption would be that there would be low transaction costs between the incurred in the private bargaining between the two parties. And also another assumption would be that property rights would be assigned by the government. The assumption for his theory was that as long as there were low transaction costs in terms of the private bargaining, and that property rights were assigned by the government and enforceable, the two parties that are experiencing a negative externality would solve this problem and come to a socially efficient output. Remember, the socially efficient output is attained at that point of equilibrium that you've been looking at, where we've seen that the marginal social benefit is equal to the marginal social cost, right? So if it was pollution, then as long as the two parties, if it's pollution, who are the two parties? It would be the polluting farm and the people near the polluting farm that are suffering the negative consequence of the pollution, that are inhaling in those greenhouse gas emissions that are polluted by the farm, for example, carbon dioxide. So for him, he said that as long as these two parties agree and bargain, then the problem of negative externality would be solved, and the efficient outcome would be attained. And he gave a number of examples. He gave a number of examples, and in his examples, he explains a number of scenarios. He gives, for example, he gave an example of a scenario where we are experiencing a negative externality, for example, of production, where we saw that if a farm is polluting into the river, right? It's polluting its emissions into the river, but there are individuals that are fishing, that are fishing from that river. Then those are the two parties: the individuals of the that are fishing from that river, and then this polluting farm that is polluting by emitting, for example, its sewerage into the river. So for him, he said that the property rights could be assigned to any of the parties. For example, if the government assigned property rights the government assigned property rights to the fishermen. We can assume that these are the fishermen, that they are individuals that are using the river, that if the property rights for ownership of the river was assigned by the government to the fishermen, then it would be that the fishermen are the owners of the river, and therefore it would be the farm now to pay the fishermen to allow the farm to pollute, to be the farm now to pay the fishermen to allow it to pollute into the river. And on the other side, he said that if the property rights are assigned to the farm, if the government assigned the property rights of owning the river, it assigns it to the farm, then on the other hand, it would be the fishermen to pay the farm to allow for the farm to allow them to fish. It would be the fishermen to pay the farm to allow them to fish from that river. And he said that regardless of who is assigned these property rights, the outcome would be efficient. Regardless of who was assigned these property rights, the outcome would be efficient. So Ronald Coase, he received what we call a Nobel Prize Award in the 1990s for his theory, the Coase theorem. In the 1990s, Ronald Coase received what we call a Nobel Prize Award for his theory, the Coase theorem. And in 2013, he died. So that is the Coase theorem. However, this theorem was criticized on a number of grounds. This theorem was criticized on a number of grounds. So of course here we are looking at, for example, a negative with the Coasean solution or the Coase theory. He looks at, for example, production externalities of, for example, the steel market, a steel manufacturing plant, for example, which is an example of a negative externality of production, which we have already seen. And he says that here, the bargaining, the private bargaining between the two parties, for example, here the steel manufacturing factory and the people that are living near the steel manufacturing factory, as long as they bargained, at the end of the day, we would be able to get an efficient outcome. We would be able to get an efficient outcome. Now, let us look at the criticisms or the problems of the Coasean solution, or the limitations of the Coase theorem, right? So the Coase theorem, it has a it was criticized on the ground that the assignment problem. For him, he was only looking at two parties, but it can happen that there are more than two parties that are facing this challenge. So if there are more than two parties, what will happen, right? For example, we look at pollution, where we see global warming. There are many factories and industries around the world. And at the end of the day, how are they going to negotiate? Because for him, he was only looking at two parties. But what if there are many polluting farms and many people that are suffering the pollution around the world? How is that theory actually going to happen when we have multiple parties experiencing the problem of negative externalities? Then the theory was also criticized with the holdout problem. With the holdout problem, basically here, the theory was criticized in a way that it is not automatic that these parties will always agree. It can happen that they do not agree, that one party can fail to agree, right? To agree with what you call private bargaining. So if one party refuses to agree, then the theory will not be applicable. And then another problem of this theory or the limitation is the free rider problem, whereby, for example, we see that some countries do pollute. They do pollute and they never, for example, we have what you call, and they are never accountable for their pollution around the world. For example, we have a convention that is called the Kyoto Protocol. You read more about it, but it's basically a global convention that is aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions like carbon dioxide around the world, and countries subscribe to it and become members. So if a country, for example, refuses to subscribe and become a member, it will be polluting and it will not be accountable for its pollution. So, and then also his theory, the Coas theorem, assumes that for the parties to agree and for the theory to be applicable, that the transaction cost should be low. The transaction costs that he was talking about here are basically the costs of negotiating, yeah? Of course, when two parties are negotiating, they have to draft down, for example, documents of agreement and that kind of thing. But for him, he said that the negotiation should not take all those costs, the time and money, right? In terms of resources, the negotiation should not be costly between these parties in terms of drafting agreements and documentary evidence, yeah, and documentary agreements, yeah. So, but at the end of the day, it is not, of course, when parties are agreeing, they have to incur costs in terms of maybe documenting the agreement. So those ones, the costs have to be there. And for him, he assumed that either the costs were low or almost not there, right? So the Coas theorem was criticized on that ground. So unless there is any question, I want us to stop here and we shall meet next time. Thank you for listening.